Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's Nuclear Energy Agency Expert Roundtable on developing safety cases for various radioactive waste disposal facilities. People from around the world have registered to participate in this event. To ensure a stable connection and considering the large number of attendees, your video and audio functions have been disabled. We've received so many questions already that we've had to do some pre-selection. But if you have some questions during the seminar, please feel free to use the Q&A function to put them forward, but do please note that we may not have enough time to take all the questions. Today's discussion is being recorded and will be made available online in the near future. It is now my pleasure to give the floor to the Director General of the NEA, Mr. William D. Magwood IV.
Well, thank you very much and welcome to all of you. And I hope wherever you are around the world, and many of you who are joining us today, that you're safe and healthy and looking forward to the end of this very, very long global health crisis. I do think we're close to the end of this experience and that we're beginning to move out of it. And I'm looking forward to having the opportunity to see many of you in person. As I think you know, this event that we are staging today is a precursor to a conference that's been postponed a couple of times that we hope to hold. In fact, we are now planning to hold in Bucharest, Romania in February of 2022. This workshop will be called Developing Safety Cases for Various Radioactive Waste Facilities, much like today's webinar. And I appreciate our colleagues in Romania for hosting this conference when it takes place early next year. I personally find this subject to be a very important one and a very one close to my thoughts, because as some people already know, I've said many times that I started my career working in radioactive waste. And when I was very young, in my first assignment, I remember having a difficult radioactive waste issue that I didn't understand. I took it to a senior engineer and asked him to look at it, and he stared at the piece of paper for quite some time. He looked up at me and he said, "Bill, waste is hard." Well, waste is hard, but it's not impossible. It takes a lot of analysis to know how to dispose of radioactive waste. It takes a very careful process to be able to decide whether a particular facility is appropriate for a particular type of waste. The NEA years ago developed the concept of the safety case. And the safety case is a discipline by which the issues associated with the disposal of radioactive waste are assessed through a very careful safety process to support decision-making from the core of a safety at the core of a proposed facility. We have a group that's been around since the year 2000, the Integrated Group for the Safety Case, that has been working very hard to pull experts together to support geological disposal development around the world. Since the formation of this group has made significant achievements in many areas and developed modern safety cases we know it today. This webinar will begin to highlight some of those issues. And I'm very pleased to have a very illustrious panel with us who will be discussing these important safety-related issues and how we go about developing a safety case for radioactive waste disposal facilities. To begin, we're going to have the chairman of the NEA's Radioactive Waste Management Committee, Mr. Hiroki Umeki, who's also, in his day job, the executive director of the Nuclear Waste Management Organization in Japan, NUMO. His committee oversees the work of the IGSC, and I will give him a chance today to give an overview of the Radioactive Waste Management Committee's role in the safety case development in order to set the scene for today's discussion. So, Mr. Umeki, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Director General Magwood, and good morning, afternoon, or evening. Firstly, I thank the NEA very much for organizing this webinar, and I'm very happy to be here. The expertise, approach, and strategies required for the development of assessment scenarios, the management of uncertainties, and the associated risk evaluation in compiling and presenting safety cases for different disposal facilities share some commonalities. Having its effort focused mainly in deep geological disposal in the past decades, and noting the importance of managing radioactive waste in a holistic and sustainable manner, the RWMC in 2016 issued a vision statement asserting that its future work focus shall go beyond deep geological disposal. In particular, the RWMC is considering further utilizing the existing IGSC expertise to gather the essential technical safety information for developing other disposal facilities. Surface and near surface disposal facilities that are currently operating may be updating their safety case as part of the operating license. For all the facilities, there could be plans for updating the safety case in support of closure of a facility. Today, we will be discussing how the experience of deep geological disposal and that of other disposal options can be shared in the development, use, and communication of a safety case. Our distinguished panel will be describing their perspectives in this regard. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Umeki. Appreciate your comments to open this webinar. But before launching a discussion, as I mentioned, we are going to be holding an in-person conference to discuss the safety case in Bucharest, Romania in February 2022. To give an overview of the workshop and the progress towards it, I'd like to invite Alice Dima, who's Deputy Director General of the Romanian Nuclear Waste and Radioactive Waste Management Agency, to give us a bit of a report. Ms. Dima, would you like to take the floor?
Thank you, Mr. Director General. Thank you, everyone. Dear colleague, it is my pleasure to address you on behalf of the Romanian Nuclear Radioactive Waste Agency, our message concerning the organization of the International Workshop on Developing Safety Cases for Various Radioactive Waste Disposal Facilities. We are both proud and honored to host this outstanding event next year in February. And with this occasion, I would like to invite you to attend on this event in Romania, in Bucharest. Despite the pandemic context we are facing now to the COVID situation, and we are confident that we shall be able to organize a face-to-face successful event. During the 3 days workshop, the participants will exchange experience and lesson learned on the safety case developing for different radioactive waste disposal facility. We propose also to include a technical visit to the Horiahulu Bay National Institute for Physics and Nuclear Engineering in order to present you the Romanian successful project concerning the disposal of the institutional waste, decommissioning, as well as the treatment and conditioning of the radioactive waste. Also, on the occasion of the event, we'll present you our progress and lesson learned from our developing project for low and intermediate level waste disposal that will be located near to the nuclear power plant from Cernavoda. We are looking forward to welcome to you in Romania next year from 8 to 10 February for a very fruitful and successful event under the auspice of the Nuclear Energy Agency. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dima. We're all looking forward to that event, and I personally can't wait for an opportunity to visit Bucharest again. This will be an excellent event. And I, again, thank your agency for going through so much effort to plan and host this. And I know it's been disappointing to have to postpone this so many times, but I'm pretty sure this time we're going to have it. So looking forward to it. Thank you. Now we're going to proceed with the webinar at this point, and to orient us, we've invited 3 very experienced speakers to give us their thoughts on the issue of the safety case at various national levels. The speakers will provide a very broad overview by addressing both the near surface, intermediate depth, and deep geological repository cases. So we will get a very good overview of what a safety case is like in the process for developing it. So to begin, we'll start with the United Kingdom. And let me invite Lucy Bailey, who is head of the Research Support Office at Radioactive Waste Management Limited Organization, RMW in the UK. Ms. Bailey chairs the NEA Integration Group for the safety case, and she'll present the main IGSC findings that can help any member country learning from the DGR safety case. She will also highlight how the UK benefited from these outputs and what the potential differences between DGRs and near surface facilities can be. I know this has been a conversation that the group has been having in recent years, so I'm looking forward to your presentation. Please, Lucy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bill. Next slide, please. This talk will explore the safety case concept developed by the IGSC. I'll also provide some examples of how we've applied it in the UK. The UK programme is currently at a generic conceptual stage in its safety case, but we are now starting to work with communities to find a suitable location for a deep geological repository. And hence we're preparing to think about developing site-specific safety cases. In this talk, I will consider the extent to which the various aspects of the work of the IGSC may be transferable to other types of disposal facility. But there's also a need to recognise, largely because of the very different timescales and hence uncertainties involved, that there are some areas where the safety case strategy is quite different between deep geological and near surface facilities. Next slide. The IGSC has recently published a key brochure setting out its achievements over its first 20 years, and I commend that to you. It's available on our website using the link shown on this slide. Since its conception, the IGSC focus has evolved, initially from a focus of defining the very concept of a safety case and what is needed in a safety case, through considerations of how a safety case is developed, and more recently, our focus has been on how we can build confidence in safety. Many of the general approaches for integrating safety arguments, exploring safety functions, etc., are valid for all types of waste facilities, although of course the specific applications will vary. However, in all cases, we need to start with a solid system understanding. First of all, we need to understand the types of wastes which we need to dispose of. We need to understand our geological setting. We need to understand the properties of the engineered barriers that we've designed to contain the waste. And we need to understand how this whole system will evolve. And in the case of deep geological repositories, we're talking an evolution of hundreds of thousands of years. Much of our IGSC work has focused on methodologies for integrating system understanding. In particular, developing the important concept of safety functions, how we can understand the key performance of the different components of our system, and how to handle the inevitable uncertainties due to the long timescales. It's also very important that the IGSC involves regulators, and it's important to remember that a safety case is always developed in a specific regulatory context, and that context will have a strong influence on the safety strategy. It's also important to remember that given that many programs rely on volunteer or consent-based siting, stakeholder interactions are also key, and the safety case needs to be developed throughout with engagement and communication in mind. This is not just an add-on activity at the end. So throughout the repository project lifecycle, the safety case is an essential tool for integrating, synthesizing, and communicating all safety relevant information. Next slide. A key IGSC report, first published in 2004 and then updated in 2013, set out the nature, purpose, and context of a safety case. And it recognized that a safety case is generally made in the context of a key decision. Safety cases are developed at different stages in the life cycle of a disposal facility. Those developed at the early conceptual stage will have more uncertainty and less specific detail than a safety case developed for a licensing application. But at every stage, there is a need for a clear safety strategy, and that safety strategy covers the siting and design, the strategy for managing the program, and of course the assessment strategy. The safety case presents a synthesis of the analysis and the evidence that provides confidence to support the decision being taken at that stage, whether that's a decision about the conceptual feasibility of a design, the choice of a site, or indeed a licensing application. This generic IGSC flowchart has been adapted and used in many programs. We'll shortly be seeing how it's been used in the French program. The IGSC MESA project, the Methods for Safety Assessment, developed it further. And it's now currently being proposed to use the MESA outputs to support knowledge management tools being developed in other parts of the NEA. In connection with the role of the safety case as a decision-informing tool, in 2010, the IGSC held an expert topical session on optimization, which produced the following consensus statement, bringing together views of international implementers and regulators to say that once the safety objectives, by which means dose or the risk targets or any other national constraints have been met, further optimization should be aimed at moving the project forward as efficiently as possible. And this could largely be reflected as a cost optimization. This has been a really important statement in enabling national programs to move forward. There's a need for an iterative way of working to integrate activities and build confidence, but not a never-ending cycle of risk reduction. This is perhaps something we're all learning now as we work out how to emerge from the COVID pandemic. Next slide. This is a diagram from the UK programme that illustrates in very broad terms our iterative approach to safety case development. It's a process that's led by system requirements. Those requirements lead to a specification. From that specification, a design is developed and assessed, and through an iterative process, we identify where we have gaps in our knowledge, we expand our knowledge base through research, we improve our specification and design, and reassess. It's this iterative approach that actually builds understanding and is an essential part of the safety case. Next slide. In a deep geological repository, system understanding is about both the engineered barriers and the geological environment in which they're constructed. We need to understand how the multiple barriers work together to provide safety. This is a generic UK example. It illustrates the barriers and associated safety functions for both high heat generating wastes, such as spent fuel and vitrified high level waste, and the low heat generating intermediate level waste. At the highest level, we need assurance of safety functions that will isolate and contain the wastes over the required timescales. We also need safety functions that will provide mechanisms that limit or retard the release of any contaminants and provide stability for the disposal system. Of course, the actual barriers and their relative importance of their safety functions will vary even between different geological repository concepts, and certainly for near surface facilities. However, the overall philosophy of designing a facility for which we can produce a robust safety case is common to all disposal types. Next slide. A robust safety case is built on multiple barriers and safety functions. These are the things that provide the intrinsic safety or the defense in depth. A stable waste form, a good containment, a backfill or buffer to protect the container, and of course the geological barrier. It's important that we don't rely on any single safety function. For example, the use of a buffer to both protect the waste containers and provide a slow diffusion barrier should a waste container fail. But as well as not relying on any single safety function, a multiple factor safety case should also present multiple lines of reasoning to provide independent arguments for safety assurance. These safety arguments include a detailed understanding of our research. In fact, any safety case needs to start with the evidence that we understand how the system will evolve. It prevents insight analysis, detailed total system modeling, and perhaps also things like comparisons with natural or anthropogenic analogues and other more qualitative safety arguments that perhaps may be more helpful in communicating to different audiences. It's when we bring together the intrinsic safety provided by a good design and a well-chosen site, and the assurance of multiple lines of evidence to support strong safety arguments underpinned by evidence, that we have a robust safety case. Next slide. A key safety case concept applicable to all situations is that of the base scenario, sometimes called the normal evolution or reference scenario, that demonstrates how we expect the disposal system to evolve. In the UK approach, the base scenario is a particularly essential concept to developing our safety case. In our base scenario, we aim to have a broad brush description of how we expect the system to evolve over hundreds of thousands of years. We aim to include all those features, events, and processes, FEPs, that are considered more likely than not to occur over our assessment timescales. So that includes all the natural processes and also the natural degradation processes of our engineered barriers. In our regulatory context, we need to show consistency of the base scenario with our regulatory risk guidance level, which in the UK is a conditional risk of 10 to the minus 6, 1 in a million per year to an individual. And this is equivalent to just 1% of the risk from background radiation in the UK, which I think gives you a level of the confidence and the skill that we are working to in our disposal system safety cases. If you take away one thing from this talk, I'd like it to be that in a safety case, we are not required to predict the future. Rather, we are required to be very confident that all credible evolutions of the future are safe, by which we mean lying within that regulatory safety envelope. And this is why our confidence is increased and why it's an essential part of our safety strategy to have a base scenario that is as broad ranging as possible to thus encompass all reasonable potential evolutions. Next slide. The general approach to using scenarios in a safety case is applicable to all types of facility, although clearly the actual scenarios will be different for different disposal concepts. This will be particularly the case for relevant variant scenarios that may be considered. We consider variant scenarios to be triggered by FEPs that could perturb the base scenario. For example, a major earthquake or perhaps a human intrusion, somebody inadvertently drilling into the disposal facility. There's clearly uncertainty associated with such FEPs and with their timing, and hence it would introduce quite a lot of bias if that was included within the base scenario. To have a robust safety case, we need to consider a wide variety of scenarios. However, we can subsume them. We can consider representative variant scenarios for a range of classes. And of course, because our base scenario is consistent with our regulatory risk guidance level, we only need to consider variants that would lead to a higher conditional risk than the base scenario. Therefore, at the generic stage, we use these scenarios to identify the safety envelope of the base scenario. And at the site-specific stage, we can explore what-if scenarios to test the robustness of our repository system. It's very important, though, when presenting what-if scenarios, i.e. those things that you don't actually expect to occur, that you give due consideration to the weighting and explain how that would be applied to the calculated consequences. Next slide. So how do we define our base scenario at the conceptual stage? As stated, our aim is to have a broad brush representation that encompasses our system evolution and satisfies our regulatory requirements. Next click. By considering the system safety functions and the FEPs that could interact with them, we can identify specific credible evolutions and assess their consequences, as illustrated by these blue circles here. Next click. Some of these situations may lie at the edge or even just outside our regulatory risk guidance level. And where this is the case, we can identify the requirements that we might need to place on our engineered barriers in order to bring them within the base scenario envelope. This is how that iterative way of working enables us to build our understanding and build a robust design for our disposal system. Next click. Of course, there may be some scenarios that we cannot substantiate and bring within our base scenario. And these are the ones that will need to be considered as a separate variant scenario. Next slide. Our regulatory context defines the context in which our safety cases are produced. And in the UK, we have some very helpful guidance in terms of managing different types of uncertainties and how we treat scenarios. We identify those scenarios that can be reliably quantified and those that cannot. Of course, our aim is always to reduce uncertainties wherever possible and practical. But given the long timescales associated with a DGR, there will always be residual uncertainties that we need to treat explicitly. In the UK, quantifiable uncertainties are explicitly treated in risk assessments using probabilistic techniques within the base scenario where possible. Unquantifiable uncertainties are generally used to define variant scenarios, which are assessed separately to our base scenario. Future human intrusion directly into the disposal facility is identified in our regulatory guidance as a special case and is considered as a what-if scenario, where our aim is to demonstrate low likelihood and also to consider any practical mitigation measures that could reduce the consequence should it occur. Clearly, different types of facilities will have different uncertainties, and there are different strategies for managing different uncertainties. Next slide. The IGSC has also developed a number of tools to assist in safety case development. Perhaps most prominent of these is the NEA FEP database that has been an ongoing development throughout the history of the IGSC and is now available on a web-based form on our website. The link is there. The repository metadata project, RepNet, has also developed a number of tools to help in managing information to underpin safety cases, particularly the managing of metadata. And in the UK, we have developed our own digital safety case management tool. We call it VISI, Visualization of System Information. It links the NEA FEP database directly to our RWM system requirements. It links our safety functions, our FEPs, the safety claims and arguments and underpinning research evidence in a network that enables us to trace where we have strong evidence to support our safety arguments to underpin our safety claims. It enables us to identify where perhaps there may be knowledge gaps and thus use that to drive our research program. Next slide. Safety case communication is an important aspect that is common to all disposal facilities. The IGSC is currently collaborating with our sister organisation, the Forum for Stakeholder Confidence, to develop best practice in safety communication. This collaboration is ongoing. We have a joint workshop planned this autumn, but we have already identified some key principles, including the importance of building trust in the regulatory process, seeking to understand the specific stakeholder audience, including recognition that there are different perceptions of risk that may be emotional and not just technical. Above all though, and this runs I think through all our safety case work, is the importance of building trust. This involves trust in technical competence and also trust in social integrity. And I think it's only where we have mutual trust that we can have effective communication. And it's only where we have effective communication that we can have a legitimate and authentic decision-making process for a disposal facility. Next slide. So, in summary, I think there are a number of aspects of the IGSC's development and learning which can be applicable to other types of disposal facility. I think these are largely around the safety case concept, and the safety case as a structured process for integrating science, engineering, safety assessment, and quality assurance to build confidence in the decision-making process. There is much learning in safety case methodologies that can be applied to different contexts, always recognizing, of course, the importance of the national regulatory context. There are also safety case tools developed by the IGSC that may have use in wider contexts, and our experience and lessons learned regarding effective safety case communication. Next slide. However, there are some differences, and these largely arise from the very different uncertainties and the very different timescales involved. This perhaps is particularly the case for human intrusion. For human intrusion, the strategy is to isolate the most hazardous wastes through depth, using the deep disposal to isolate and avoid and minimize any likelihood of human intrusion. For near surface facilities, it may be harder to guarantee isolation for such long timescales. So there is a greater reliance on waste acceptance criteria. There may be a tendency to consider only shorter lived wastes, and also to put confidence in an institutional control period. So in summary, the strategy for a DGR is to reduce the consequences, to reduce the likelihood of human intrusion, whereas for near surface facilities, it is perhaps more a focus on minimizing the consequence. However, despite some of these differences, I think overall there is a huge wealth of information and learning that can be shared from the IGSC that is relevant to other facilities. And the IGSC welcomes the opportunity to collaborate in an appropriate way to share relevant expertise from its work in developing safety case concepts for DGRs with those that are looking to develop safety case concepts for other types of facility. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much. That was an excellent overview. We're a little short on time, but I would like to, Lucy, if you could come back on screen for just a moment, just ask a very quick question, because you highlighted the importance of communication. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to stress this because there were two places where I think this comes into play. One, you mentioned optimization, and you put it in the terms of cost optimization, but that still requires a dialogue with stakeholders. Could you spend 30 seconds and elaborate on that a bit?
I think that the dialogue with stakeholders is really important, and I think it needs to be ongoing throughout the process. So, for example, engaging your communities right in the early stages, helping them to understand what hosting a deep geological repository would mean for them, to understand the benefits and the opportunities. And I think it is, as I said, it's all about building trust and confidence, building those relationships. And the safety case can be a key tool with that. And I think it's also important to remember, I mentioned, for example, our regulatory risk guidance level is set at 1% of the level of natural background radiation. I think a lot of people don't realize that. They don't realize just how high the safety standards are for geological disposal. And I think that's an important message to communicate to our stakeholders, the very high safety standards to which we are working.
Well, these are very high standards. And, you know, for example, we have a question for the audience about the general standard about 0.25 millisieverts per year exposure for the average population. Many of the scenarios might show slight exceedances of that number. How do you communicate exceedances to numbers like that? Because, you know, the actual health impacts are essentially non-existent, but if you have a number and instead of 0.25, your analysis shows 0.27, people think that's a big problem. How do you communicate that? How do regulators and operators talk about exceedances like that.
In the UK, as I mentioned, this is where we put so much emphasis on our base scenario, and our base scenario is consistent with our regulatory risk guidance level. We design our facility to ensure that it is. We do recognise that there are what we would describe as variance scenarios from unlikely events that could happen, that could lead to calculated consequences that lie outside that regulatory risk guidance level. So in the first instance, we would say that we have designed our facility to be safe to all reasonable, credible evolutions. There is obviously some evolutions that could avoid that. We would look to establish minimizing the likelihood of those. So for example, with human intrusion, siting away from any site where somebody might want to or be attracted to drill into a facility where there might be minerals, for example. But I think there's a concept of, just as we are perhaps learning with COVID, you need to accept some risk. It's not a case of no risk, but we are designing something that will be safe to less than 1% of the risks from natural background radiation. And even our most extreme variance scenarios, I think, are really unlikely to take us over that risk, or we would be doing something to mitigate against them. So I think it's about building that understanding and that confidence, as I said, confidence in the regulatory process that dictates what we are doing.
Yeah, I agree with that. I guess to quote your countryman, Douglas Adams, don't panic.
Yes,
right?
yeah.
All right, well, thank you very much for the overview. And we'll go on to the next speaker,
Thank you.
which is, thank you very much, which is Christopher McKinney. Mr. McKinney is Chief of the Risk and Technical Analysis Branch of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, so a former colleague of mine, so welcome. Mr. McKinney will highlight for us the variety of safety assessment topics that are similar across low, intermediate, and high-level waste. So we'll get a pretty good overview of all. So Christopher, please.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. So today I'll be talking about the safety cases on and how they compare to other sites. I will be focusing mostly on low-level waste disposal facilities for near-surface facilities, in a realization that while that tends to be a lot of the talk, just everybody has to remember that there's a wide range of near-surface facilities when you talk about radioactive waste that are have different challenges, designs, and approaches, including stuff like mining residues such as uranium and thorium mill tailings, waste from radium processing, and then specialized radioactive disposal designs for the near surface that have very specialized waste that is going to be going into them, and the approach to very low level waste, with the fact that there are sites that are designed for only very low level waste, and therefore their time of consideration for risks is a lot shorter than a lot of the other sites. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. There, thank you. Sorry. So, whoops, not that slide. One back. So the major considerations of safety cases for near surface and others can be quite similar, as was just discussed, that at a very broad level they are. You're going to be worried about the waste considerations, such as what waste do you have, what is its form, what is the disposal design of the site, and how does that waste profile change over time. So you have your waste hazard considerations for a near surface disposal facility, just like you have for an intermediate or deep geologic. And the role of engineering comes into play for a near surface facility because of a focus more on the short-lived materials of high activities with half-lives of generally less than 30 years, waste that you can control and mitigate and contain over a relatively short institution control period, especially compared to geologic waste. And then Similar to a geologic repository, you have the evaluation of your features, events, and processes. The one thing about near-surface facilities is there are lots of lessons learned out there. There are lessons learned from early radioactive waste disposal. There are lessons learned continuing to be developed from hazardous waste and other near-surface disposals that may not be radioactive that you can continue to learn from over the life of your program. Lucy brought up the fact that human inadvertent intrusion is a different level of focus in near surface because of the fact that the disposal is in the biosphere and is therefore much more impacted by the change in society and is available, can be more readily available to different modes of disruption. It was also just brought up that community outreach, involvement of stakeholders is key to making the to having a successful site for near surface or geologic repositories. And then we have some for the United States in particular, because of the way I'll be talking, is what is your regulatory oversight considerations? Who's actually going to be doing the regulation? Is there going to be transfer at some point? And other maintenance of that. Next slide, please. So this is a map of the United States with we have 4 current U.S. commercial low-level waste sites across our country. This map does not show the previously closed sites that were developed in the early 60s. 2 of these sites are original low-level waste sites for the commercial world, and with our newest site being the one in Waste Control Specialist down in Texas. All of the 4 of these sites are regulated now by the states in which they exist in, and as I noted, there are dozens of uranium mill tailing sites also present in the United States, and also this slide does not show the disposal sites managed by the Department of Energy. So there's actually a wide range of sites to get experience and to get lessons learned from. Next slide, please. So the United States has a different categorization of waste than IEA. Basically, we've subdivided the low-level waste category based on the potential consequences due to inadvertent human intrusion. So we have split the waste into classes A, B, and C, which those classes can range from requiring waste form requirements or not. And as the letters go up, A to B to C is generally increasing concentrations allowed for those types of waste, but then also increasing requirements. And those are generally available for disposal on a commercial low-level waste site. Greater than Class C is not generically allowed for disposal, and currently the NRC Commission is evaluating changing the regulations to have a more specific method of using site-specific information to determine what portions of greater than Class C waste might be able to be disposed in a specific disposal facility, taking account of their own safety cases to develop those WACs instead of the generic approach that we have in the regulations. Next slide, please. One of the waste hazard considerations is that we have a wide range of inventory coming into a commercial low waste site for near surface activities. This is everything from hospitals with their gloves and pipettes and other things, all the way to reactor waste to reactor, and from that you can have even the resins versus the radioactive metals coming from that, and then you have the large volume associated with decommissioning with relatively low concentrations. So you have cycles of different types of waste from all these different waste repositories and lots of different waste streams. And the question is that you're not going to have the same ability to have a necessarily a similar waste treatment method across the board. So the other questions are so that leads to what type of waste forms you're going to get and how durable are they over the time period of your analyses and while your waste is a hazard. And this then results in an impact on the retention and possible release of radionuclides in the future if water were to become present in the disposal cell. And this leads to probably a less focus on most near surface facilities for complex modeling of waste release from the waste itself or the waste package. And it's also is always to remember that the differing waste volumes are present, that you have some small volumes of high activity wastes mixed with large volumes of low activity waste. And so the heterogeneity of the waste can lead to quite different approaches and models. And in the end, that can result in only a few of the waste streams actually being the driver for the safety case. And lesser requirements for a number of your other waste streams. But it also provides the flexibility for the site to add or modify waste streams over the life of the site as new waste streams are identified, or operational experiences is developed, and they can now take more credit for their site or improve their safety case. Next slide, please. So this is a picture of the cell operations at Waste Control Specialists in Andrews County, Texas. And it's a open pit design. The cell is quite deep. It is, they now are approaching the fact that they can build new cells with, I believe, up to 50 meters of depth. So they approach into the zone of actually almost being, by international generic discussions, they can also claim to be also an intermediate disposal site because they're beyond the 30 meters of near surface. But it's an open pit design. They do use concrete overpacks to bring all the waste in. So the waste inside of those cylinders and boxes is in their own canisters and could just be a box of gloves and paper and other things like that. But then it's put into these overpacks to provide long-term stability of the site as it's in a concrete cell. And you got to worry about the void space and future stabilization of that site. Next slide, please. So one of the characteristics that's more present and more of a possibility to take advantage of through optimization is that you can focus on controlling the short-lived radionuclides. And that is going to be a majority of the activity coming into the site. And during their half-lives, their 10 half-lives or so, as you manage the hazard, so over the first 100 to 300 to 500 years of disposal, after disposal, you can use your site characteristics, possibly the waste form, the disposal cell design, and engineered covers to try to containing the waste while it just decays away in place and never actually has a chance to even leave the site of in any method, or leave the disposal facility by any method. And you can do that both physically and chemically. The physical ones is like the concrete overpacks that were shown, but they also add a chemical nature to the waste to effectively pre-treat the water before it can hit the hit the waste. One thing that's true in near surface is that you have options for if waste cannot be disposed in near surface. You can waste that is not appropriate in the near surface can be transferred to intermediate or geologic disposal facilities in an overall strategy, so that you can control those concentrations to make sure that you either don't have long-term considerations of like inadvertent human intrusion for those concentrations, or there may be times where you have operational considerations that will control what concentrations you're allowed at your site. This is definitely true for transportation issues when you are talking about low-level waste, and has been a concern of trying to address the discrepancy at times, but that can be another limitation that people don't think of in their safety case. Next slide, please. So FEPS as a big umbrella, you're going through the same process for FEPS analysis. You're looking at all the possible features, events, and processes that are available. You're looking at what your barrier analysis of what barriers you have at the site, or you're going to build at the site with your engineered features, and how you're going to do that, contain the waste over time, and how those barriers will change over time too. And of course, it supports the conceptual model development for the site. And even this was supported by our early regulations, where we have in our 1981 regulations, requiring specific technical information on each site to look at these features, events, and processes. One of the obviously differences is while the process is the same of looking at FEPS, the result will be different because of the different hazard profile with time on what were the initial radionuclides and waste types, all the way through what at different time periods, what are your remaining radionuclides. And so with a lot of the primary FEPS being on the engineered cover for this facility, erosion, and other FEPS like that. Next slide, please. So again, near surface facilities, people have been disposing of waste in the near surface, well, forever. So, and radiologically, we started that near surface, at least in like the United States, we started commercial disposal sites in the mid-60s. So we had early feedback from those sites in the 60s and 70s as we started disposing of waste, which led to a number of from a regulatory point of view, requirements that we put in that needed to be addressed for a safety case, or situations to avoid because of to try to help siting and other considerations. For example, in hydrology, we have the fact that we had water retention in disposal cells where the base of the water of the cell was much tighter than the cover, and that therefore the disposal cell started to retain water, and there was some degree of overtopping where the water would come out the top of the cell, not through the bottom. We also had unidentified fast flow groundwater paths that would actually challenge the monitoring system, and we had cases where we had hits of contamination go through the monitoring ring and appear in surface water as the first indicator well beyond the ring. We waste inventory concerns that were especially a point of discussion quite a bit, especially in the early years, of what were the appropriate concentration limits, especially for, again, long-lived wastes and what type of waste forms are appropriate. I mean, we had people disposing of cardboard boxes and wooden boxes and other things that would lead to potentially from a stability concerns in the future as they made void space as they decayed away. Obviously, there was there is issues with the presence of hazardous material that would either allow the material to move faster in the environment, or could be a different threat, such as having metal fires in your low-level waste site, which happened several years ago at one of the sites in the United States. We also had a questions on the present treatment of liquids, both liquid just being in the waste containers, but also that even when they dealt with trying to deal with liquids, what type of treatment you had, because a lot of them just used basic absorbents, and those absorbents would lead to quick release once water hits them. If you're interested, there is a new reg on the NRC website, new reg 1853, that talks about the history and framework of the commercial low-level waste radioactive waste management system, and it goes through several of these older sites and the lessons we learned. Next slide, please. So, inadvertent human intrusion. Obviously, it tends to be much more of an issue, again, because the near-surface facilities and shallow intermediate facilities will be more accessible for potential intrusion. There will be a larger variety of methods of disturbance of one of these sites versus a geologic repository, and we're still talking about long time periods to deal with the hazard waste. Even for the short-lived materials, you know, we're talking 300 years or so for the waste to decay away. There is still the high probability, if we don't take actions, to have a loss of knowledge of the sites. And there are things we can do to reduce the probability, but as Lucy said, you can also focus on making sure that you manage the waste concentrations and types of waste to manage the consequence side of it. Next slide, please. So in our regulations, we have requirements in the United States that go after both sides of the risk calculation. We have requirements that limit the likelihood of intrusion, and most of these requirements at a high level are very similar to what is discussed for geologic repositories, with requiring active controls, passive controls such as monuments, and using ownership of the land to try to contain everything. We also then go after the consequences in different ways by either having generic requirements or specific requirements for waste to try to ensure that we are not allowing too high of concentrations to be present in the site. Next slide, please. So, community outreach and involvement. Most of the outreach is performed by the operator. They are going to be present in the community. They are members of the community. They can establish citizen advisory panels. They will be working with their local organizations because, again, their site is right there in the community, and they tend to be, and they'll have a local footprint to that community. Whereas as regulators, we tend to focus on explaining the regulations and allowing public comment on any changes or modifications, the identifying hearing opportunities during the evaluation of the application or changes to the license, discussing our decision-making process to the public, what it is and why did we make the decisions we did, and then of course announcing the review findings and decisions. So most of the work of community outreach is really on the operator, although the regulators need to provide a framework and explain the safety framework, the safety case, and how the regulators are making their decisions, and provide opportunities there for the stakeholders to be involved. Next slide, please. So, as I said before, all of the current disposal sites are managed by the states that they happen to be in. These are all in the United States called agreement states. They have made an agreement with the federal government and can act as the NRC in their states. But it's depending on their agreement on what they can do. But so NRC still establishes the generic regulations for like low-level waste and guidance. We provide technical assistance if the state requests it. We evaluate any general approaches to new waste streams that might apply to all the states. And we evaluate the state programs for consistency. And we will continue to license material not part of the state agreement. So in some states, they only take they only regulate fission products and not source material such as uranium and thorium. So we would regulate uranium and thorium in those states. State programs have the responsibility of licensing and oversight of the material within their state, and then they assist in other state and national program reviews for consistency. So they will come and review, people from Texas will assist us in reviewing the state of Washington's low-level waste program. Next slide, please. So so for conclusions, we have that near surface facilities, we have the same range of considerations as Lucy said earlier, that safety cases as a structural process are the same. It's going to be difference in the details. And that's not only driven by the type of waste you have, but it's what site you have and what is your approach to safety at the site. Where are you focusing to make your barriers and contain the waste over the time period needed? Everybody needs community outreach to make it successful. The larger differences that people can focus on are that we have a different approach or a different focus on inadvertent human intrusion. There is obviously the fact that in an overall waste strategy, you can shift waste from near surface facilities potentially to geologic repositories to have added protection from inadvertent human intrusion if necessary. And there's also a lot of possibilities of lessons learned from either previous site operations or similar types of near surface facilities. For example, every site relies in some part on their engineered covers. Well, engineered covers are used in hazardous waste sites, are used in the uranium mill tailing area. So a lot of cross learning can be done across a lot of sites with some similar aspects to their safety cases. And next slide. And I've just provided our contact information for myself, which I'm involved with low-level waste mainly, and Tim McCartan, who's involved with high-level waste. And thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. McKinney. I appreciate that very comprehensive overview of the situation in the U.S. particularly. I have a huge number of questions, but we don't have time. But let me just cue one for you. Maybe we can get to it later, which is you mentioned that the licensees are the ones that do the communication with the local communities as they're developing these low-level waste sites and disposing of different waste forms. And I wonder, we had this conversation with Lucy a little earlier about the optimization aspect of the communications. And maybe we can get to this conversation towards the end when we get to the panel discussion. But how does the optimization discussion go forward if the operator is doing it without the regulator? Because it would seem to me there would have to be some handshaking between the regulatory decisions and the public in order to reach an optimized situation. So maybe you can get some thought to that, and then we can all discuss that a little bit later. Okay. All right. So we'll move on to the last of our three opening speakers. That will be Ms. Virginie Waslin, who is the head of the Waste Management Strategy Department at ANDRA, the French National Radioactive Waste Management Agency. She will describe the French approach to utilizing both near surface disposal and deep geological repository safety case features to develop the intermediate depth disposal in France. This is a project for a category of waste with low-level activity, but mainly contaminated with long-lived radionuclides that requires isolation from near-surface human activities. So, Ms. Waslin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, DG Magwood. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. So I'm very pleased to be here today with you. The objective of the presentation I'm going to do is to illustrate how the finding of the safety case can feed the decision process at early conceptual stage of the development of a disposal, which is, in our case, as said previously, a shallow depth disposal for long-lived, low-level waste. Next slide, please. Thank you. As an introduction, I just want to remind you the current situation in France. So we have two disposals in operation, one for very low level waste. So you have an illustration on the picture on the top left of this disposal, and one for short-lived low level waste. So this disposal is represented in the second picture, so in the middle of the slide, on the left side. These disposals are in operation in east of France. We have also, for long-lived intermediate level waste and high level waste, a project which is well advanced, which is CGO project. So this project is a deep geological disposal project. One mission of ANDRA is to build a global approach of the management of all radioactive waste and materials if reclassified into waste. As material, I can mention, for example, depleted uranium. So we have to think and to build a global approach exhaustive with respect to waste inventory. This approach has to be coherent with regard to safety and best environmental practice, and also proportionate to waste harmfulness. So for that, the development of a new concept of disposal is undergoing for long-lived, low-level waste category. I'm going to present afterwards this category and which waste are concerned. Next slide, please. If we go through the flow chart presented by Lucy as in the preliminary preliminary presentation in this meeting, I'm going to illustrate more particularly the safety strategy items with the three topics: management strategy, siting and design strategy, and safety assessment strategy. Next slide, please. So now we are going to discuss about management strategy. Next slide, please. So we have in France a range of in-between waste which are unsuitable. Oh, sorry, I don't see the. Yes, it's better. I didn't see the slide before, sorry. So we have a range of in-between waste which are unsuitable for surface disposal, but do not necessarily require deep geological disposal. Such waste are graphite waste, for example, coming from the first reactor generation of reactor we had in France, natural uranium graphite gas, radium and uranium bearing waste, including technical norm, part of bituminized sludges and maintenance waste, and also some valuable material like depleted uranium, for example, that may be classified as waste in the future. So for those waste, a a graded approach is applied in compliance with IAEA SSR 5, and a new concept of disposal is studied. Next slide, please. Regarding this category, which is in between the long-lived, low-level waste category, if you have a look on this graph you have on the screen, you can see that the average specific activity of the waste which are in this category is in between the long-lived intermediate level waste and the short-lived low-level waste or very low-level waste. Regarding now the volume of this category, what we can mention is that the volume is higher than 250,000 cubic meter. So as you can see, more than 2 times the volume of waste we have to deal with the CGO project. Next slide, please. If we go now to the specific activities of the various long-lived, low-level waste families, so they have characteristics, different characteristics. If we look on the decay of the activity of graphite waste, for example, as you can see on the scheme, on the graph, you have a decay with time of the specific activity for graphite waste, which is not the case for the family containing uranium, thorium-bearing waste, for which you have no decay of the activity with time. Click, please. So the question is, do we need a common or specific disposal concept, as the behavior of, for example, these 2 categories is quite different with time. So the question, this question could be addressed in the safety case. Click, please. In the French waste management plan combines low-level, long-lived, low-level waste and shallow disposal. Next slide, please. So now we are going to discuss about, to present our strategy for this shallow disposal, and more particularly the seating and design strategy step. Next slide, please. So what are shallow disposal specificities? So near to the surface, natural changes occur over shorter time scales than deeper underground due to erosion by wind, rainwater, weathering, climate-induced processes. But also we have geodynamic uncertainties which increase over 10,000 years, with changes in the future boundary conditions of the system, like hydrogeology, changes in the disposal system itself, chemical, hydrological changes, and also a change of temperature conditions. We have also change of the disposal, like reduction of the thickness and or performance of containment barriers interposed between the waste and the environment, so the engineered barriers, but also the nuclear waste packages. And also in shallow disposal, situations without containment are likely to intervene in the long term, which is not the case for deep geological disposal. Another item also is a protection against ordinary human activities, which is also limited at that depth. Next slide, please. If we go on to through the French particular case, so after a screening process, a site was identified in order to develop such concept. So an outcropping clay layer is being investigated in Aube district, so in east of France, not far from our disposal, which are already in operation. An area of 10 square kilometer has been chosen. Next slide, please. So what are the strengths and the limit to take into account for design and siting in the safety case from this site? So the strengths are the containment capability of the clay layer. So for most of the radionuclides so we have in our waste, the technical ability to build shallow structure in this layer, but we have also some limits. Limits are specific to the site, the volume of clay available in order to implement a disposal. As I said before, we have a huge volume of waste in this category. And we have also other limitations we have to take into account, which are inherent to the concept. For example, the robustness of containment at long time scales. Next slide, please. So, well, we investigate different construction methods to fit the safety case. On the left part of the slide, you can see open air cell. So it's one of the construction method which is studied. So to excavate, well, to dig from the surface directly the cell. And on the right side, so you have underground method, which is to launch a tunnel from the surface in order to dig and to build the cell, so in the clay layer. We studied two methods in order to fit the safety case, but also in order to take into consideration environmental point of view, because for those two construction methods, of course, the impact on the environment will not be the same as from open air construction methods. We are going to excavate a large amount of rocks and to undamage the surface. Next slide, please. So we have also studied some some new method in order for launching a tunnel, for example. And you have here an example of what is done for metro construction. And what is interesting in our case is that the machine can be launched directly from some small structures like wells, trenches, and it's do not need long structure like for deep geological disposal. And we can have, in this case, a direct access from the surface to the disposal cells. Next slide, please. Regarding now the range of shallow depths in clay we can reach with the different methods. So with open pit, we can have cells shallow depths, so from 10 to 30 meters depths. And for underground digging, we can go through 10 meters with a micro tunnel machine till 80 meters. Next slide, please. Well, to resume this item, the design must seek an optimum between constructive techniques, waste characteristics, and site constraints. Taking into consideration the clay thickness above and below disposal cells. This in order to have a containment of radionuclides. Also to take into account chemical conditions within disposal cells. In shallow disposal, there's a sensitivity to external geodynamic evolutions, especially erosion, as the depth is not so high. And also a question of isolation from ordinary human activities. All of these data or input for the safety assessment. Click, please. Next click. Yes. And then this safety assessment with siting and design will be an iterative process. And then finally, the final design will be one of the findings of the safety case. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to go through the safety assessment strategy. Next slide. So regarding the safety assessment strategy, so the thinkings concern the modalities of a graded safety approach. So the questions are what balance between isolation and containment, or what role for inadvertent human intrusion scenarios in the long term when you will have erosion process and the disposal will be nude. Also questions on the progress on safety expectations over very long time scales. So how to manage increasing uncertainties over time. This was also addressed by Lucy in her talk, and also the acceptability of residual risk in the long term. All of these questions implies to continue the dialogue between implementer, regulator, and also stakeholders, of course, which are involved in the development of the project. Next slide, please. Now, in perspective in our work. Next slide, please. So at this initial stage, which is a conceptual stage, so we need to define the inventory of waste which can be disposed of in our site, which is studied. So for that, inventory, site design, safety requirement will feed the safety case, and the result, the findings of this safety case will give us the part of the inventory which could be disposed of in offsite, and also the initial design. Then we have to elaborate and compare various waste management scenarios in order to find some solutions for the inventory of waste which could not be disposed of in offsite. So we have to investigate complementary concepts providing various isolation and containment performances with regard to the diversity of waste. And also we have a request from our Waste Management National Plan, which provides for new site screening in addition to the whole site under survey. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, and appreciate your overview. We are a little bit behind schedule, so I won't ask a lot of questions of you at this point, but I do want to note that you showed a very interesting graph highlighting the very high activity level of graphite And this is a discussion we've had within the NEA for some time. And I think there's now an interest in proceeding to look at options for dealing with this graphite. But your chart, I thought, did a very good job of highlighting why this is such a difficult issue. Also, and maybe we'll bring the others on and talk about optimization a little bit, because I thought your comments about the interplay between Andra, the regulator, and the stakeholders is very interesting. So let's explore that. And in fact, let me invite all the other speakers, including the chair of our RWMC, to come on camera, Mr. Umeki, and join the conversation. Well, first, let me thank all of you for your comments. You were excellent discussion today, and we appreciate all the insights that you shared. And let me start with this optimization question. And because I was listening to all of your presentations, and all of you touched on the role of the stakeholders. But the structures of all of your various national programs are very different. And perhaps since I invited Chris to talk about his situation, maybe you could talk a little bit about how optimization might work in the US context when the operator has most of the communication going with the stakeholders. How do you see that interplay, that back and forth moving forward?
Yes, I mean, one thing is looking at it from the fact that optimization is an iterative process. And so therefore, even before the safety cases or a change to the safety case is brought to the regulator, there's going to be a lot of iteration that the operator developer is going to do, which gives them a lot of opportunity to reach out to the stakeholders at that step, even before it comes to the regulator. So they have a lot more opportunities. Once it enters the regulatory process, of course, and even before then, we can be there to provide what is the regulatory framework, what are the requirements, how would this approach potentially go with that, and give that as part of the discussion with the stakeholders in optimization while the developer operator leads those discussions of what they're thinking about doing. And once it enters the regulatory nature, then they provide the safety case to us. Then there are some formal stakeholder involvement steps that start to kick in that involves all three groups as it goes forward. So so during the it's informal, then goes to more formal.
Right. So it graduates to a formal process. Ms. Wasland, maybe you could comment. In France, how would you think this would work?
Well, in France, what we have is a national waste management plan in which some process are planned in order to have a discussion multi-actor group in which we can discuss. We have multi-criteria, multi-actor groups, in which we have to discuss the choice and also the justification of the choices, which is more important. In fact, we have to give information and also to go through the process we have followed in order to make the choice.
And that happen? Can that happen on a site-by-site?
Yes.
basis? Yes.
Yes. So sorry. yes. It's also when we have to choose a site. So we have to have this pluralist group. To discuss with, and yeah. Any choice has to be discussed in this plan.
And Lucy Bailey's already spoken to this, but maybe since just round out the three panelists, perhaps Lucy, you'd like to comment.
Okay, yes, in the UK, we have a vast variety of wastes because we've been in the nuclear power and energy industry for so long. So, and the NDA, the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority, is responsible for cleanup of the whole waste stream. So we have an integrated waste management strategy. Obviously, deep geological disposal is the most expensive. That is for our higher activity, our most hazardous wastes. We have an operating low-level facility for the low-level wastes. In terms of our siting process, we would obviously engage with our stakeholders. We have our published inventory, they are aware of that, and we would be optimize in terms of what is the appropriate disposal concept and disposal context for each waste stream. So in summary, that's our approach to optimization at the broadest level.
Well, thank you. And in addition to the conference that Alice Dima discussed a little bit earlier today on focus on the safety case, the NEA is also planning a high-level workshop of government participants, but also stakeholders as well, to focus on stakeholder involvement in the optimization process. And one of the objectives we have to this, and Alice Dima has joined us. Thank you for coming back, Alice. One of the focuses of this is to begin to develop a more common understanding about what optimization is and how it works, and how it can be applied to solve difficult problems. Certainly, I think there are some areas where optimization will not likely be used, but there are many opportunities. I think UK in particular has used optimization techniques very effectively at Sellafield and other situations where these difficult, often one-of-a-kind problems exist. So we'll have a workshop on that. So hopefully all of you will be able to join us for that. And so let me there were some questions we received that I'd like to go over. And one is, comes to mind when I was listening to Ms. Waslin's presentation, because she focused a lot on geology, on the clay that they are working in France. And it raises an interesting question that came from the audience originally, which is the importance of the geology in these different types of waste disposal challenges, going from low-level waste to all the way to high-level waste. Clearly, and I think Chris discussed in his presentation some of the negative experiences from the past. I think he's talking about something I was involved in. Maybe Maxi Flats is probably in that report. Is that in there? Yeah, I worked on that. It was like one of my first jobs. I didn't make the mess. I was helping clean it up. Look at me. So perhaps you could comment on that. Maybe I'll start with Mr. Umeki from a broader standpoint. How does geology play into all of these regimes? And maybe you would like to talk about the high-level waste. How important is geology in the decision making? Is it the only real issue, or is it just one of many factors? How do you see it?
I think the important thing is to provide the total system performance, combining the geology and the tailored engineered barrier system to the geology. So if the basic requirements are satisfied, the geology, it could be applied for many cases. To me, it doesn't depend on the geology itself. That is important to identify the key safety functions of the geology. It doesn't depend on the rock.
That's interesting. Yeah. Maybe Lucy Bailey, you'd like to comment? You look like you want to comment on that.
Okay, yes. I mean, obviously, for a deep geological repository, it's kind of in the name. The long-term stability of the geological environment is a key consideration. And for our, we need a stable environment for our most hazardous, higher activity wastes, because some of them have such long half-lives that we need to isolate them for such long periods. However, the engineered barriers need to be designed to work in conjunction with the geological barrier. And as I said in my presentation, we have a multi-factor safety case. It's actually a requirement that we're not relying on any single safety function. So it is this, as Mr. Umeki said, it's the overall combination of how the safety functions provided by the different barriers that you put into your multi-barrier system work together over long time scales.
Maybe Ms. Waslin would like to comment on this, because one of your charts, the one I referred to about with showing graphite, really highlights how the activity levels change over the course of time as different species decay. Is it fair to think of it as engineered systems being important to isolate these very high level activities in the nearer term, hundreds of years perhaps, and then geology completely takes over in the longer term? Is that a fair way to characterize it?
Yes, you're right. For graphite, so we have to isolate this weed from human and environment for 10,000 or a few 10,000 years. And so for that, we have to design engineered barriers, and then we have to take into account of the geology and of the migration of the different radionuclides. So in this geology and clay, it's one of the strengths of the clay is to retain some, to contain some radionuclide during the time that the activity can decrease.
Yeah,
Yes.
And I think it's also fair to say that clay, along with a lot of other geologies, also gives you the comfort level of knowing that it's already been around for a billion years, so it's probably reasonably stable. Chris, maybe you'd like to add in on this.
I mean, as they said, it is part of the overall function. What is going to be your balance of your safety case, and what is the waste type you have, and and when are the points of your protection, of how much can you rely on the engineered barriers versus the geology for especially near surface materials. But as was just stated, at some point the uncertainty on the performance of those engineered barriers is going to become much larger, to the point that you probably need to rely more on the geology present in an area to make sure that there's still stability and also containment of the radionuclides, than being able to rely on just the engineered barriers, whether that's a physical engineered barrier or a chemical engineered barrier.
In the case of the U.S. for Class A materials, for relatively low level materials, how important is geology in your view?
Since most of the waste will decay largely within the first 100 years or so, that it's a lot less, except for the fact that Class A can still, because of the high volume in the facility, provide small concentrations of long-lived materials that can travel through the groundwater. And so the geology could be a function on that part of the waste stream. So while a large part of the Class A will decay away, you still may have to rely on the geology for the long term for that, for the small amounts of long-lived waste that are still present.
Okay, and Alice, Dima, you're in the middle of this low-level waste discussion within Romania right now, and so how important has geology been in what you've been in your focuses? Has it been in terms of site selection? Has geology come into a big part of the conversation, or is it mostly a matter of staying away from hydrology? I mean, how do you see it?
Of course, it's an important factor that is taken into consideration for the selection of the site, but also the hydrology and the other technical aspects are important in order to demonstrate the safety of this disposal according with our legislation and regulation from the regulatory body and from the environment point of view. But it's an important issue that we already select our sites, and we have improved the characterization of the geology, and we keep going to monitoring this on the future.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. Very, very interesting. I think I see an intersection between what all three of you are saying, that geology is important but depending on what you're disposing of, other things could have great importance earlier on. So that's so really, in all cases, it really just depends on what you're disposing of. You know, I think that Chris, in your comments, you highlighted the need to have a sort of a WAC mentality. I like to put it that way, a waste acceptance criteria mentality. All of you expert panelists also talk about human intrusion, and this is either one of my favorite subjects to talk about or one of my least favorite subjects to talk about. It depends on the context, because the problem with human intrusion is it gets so philosophical and so theoretical so quickly, particularly for long-lived materials. And so maybe because you highlight this in your discussion, particularly Chris, what in your view, are we doing what we have to do to deal with this human intrusion analysis? Do you feel like that in the U.S. you have your arms around this discussion now, or do you think it's still a lot of uncertainty? How do you view it?
Well, since we're dealing with society, there's always a lot of uncertainty, but the approach to it is a different case. We have, I think that we have a recognition that stylized scenarios trying to evaluate the consequences. There are methods that we can do to try to reduce probability, but that we can't eliminate probability of this occurring. The question is, and I think the biggest factor still is part of why you probably dislike the discussion, is trying to frame it as in comparison to the base case analysis and frame it in response to whether it's a limiting factor on the safety of a site or is it not, and how is it in the overall decision making? How does it play in the overall decision making? In the commercial U.S., it's much more of a factor on what is the waste acceptance criteria. So if waste that challenges it quite greatly, well, one choice is just not to just put that in. There are situations we have that may not be a practical solution, but I think that we have a lot of good approaches for it. And as long as we continue to approach it from a disaggregated way where we deal with probability in one hand and look at consequences separately in an overall context, rather than trying to do a true risk analysis and multiply them together, because I think that the uncertainties and the probability swamp everything, and that leads you down to long discussions of philosophy.
Right, which unfortunately do happen. And Lucy Bailey, as in your position of chairing the IGSC, I'm sure you've had this conversation many, many times, and I wonder how do you differentiate the human intrusion discussion for DGRs versus other possible waste applications?
Okay. Yes, actually, I'm also involved in the IEA Hydra project, which specifically looks at human intrusion, both for deep geological and for near surface facilities. So drawing on that experience, I think, yes, there are fundamental different strategies between deep geological and near surface facilities when it comes to human intrusion, because for a deep geological facility, your focus is on avoiding it happening. So you choose your site away from anywhere where there is likely to be a mineral resource for exploitation, and you go deep. In near surface, you need to consider other scenarios. So the likelihood increases, but obviously the consequence decreases. And one of the things that the IEA Hydra project has been looking at is how you can perhaps take certain design measures to mitigate the risks should something happen. And this is probably particularly the case for the near surface and the intermediate depth facilities, perhaps putting some form of barrier. So if somebody did inadvertently, and we are talking about inadvertent human intrusion, we're not looking to protect somebody deliberately going into a disposal facility, but that might provide some alert alert that there's something untoward there. And obviously the whole system of markers and of institutional control and records management is really important, maintaining societal records. And in a normal society where there would be hopefully some form of planning consent for any major activity that should be picked up. So maintaining knowledge so that it's not inadvertent, design mitigations and markers to warn people. But overall, certainly for the deep geological repositories, choosing a site, a remote site away from anything of interest that anybody might want to drill into.
Good comments. Ms. Waslin, comments?
Yes, in our case, so for intermediate depths disposal, of course, this disposal is more accessible for potential intrusion human scenario. So we are looking for depths in order to avoid such intrusion, but due to site constraints, for those which cannot be excluded, we perform some evaluation of the impact, and we look if this impact complied with IAEA reference level, which is 20 millisievert per year. So it's how we manage.
Thank you. And maybe I'll give Alice Dean, I'll give you the last comment on this subject. Any thoughts?
For the Romanian part, I think our main challenge is to have a clear inventory in order to define this inventory to be with our engineering barrier. And also we need to reduce any kind of consequence from the form of the waste that are coming on the disposal. Different form.
Thank you. Well, let me thank all of you for your comments today. I know that, and as Lucy mentioned, there's an IAEA activity focusing just on human intrusion. So one could spend a lot of time talking about this, and I think everyone on this screen probably has spent a lot of time talking about this. But it is a real challenge for anyone designing a waste disposal facility, because the answers are get very uncertain as you go out 10,000 years and beyond, because you can't promise that regulators are going to show up with a clipboard to make sure that everything is in order 10,000 years from now. It's a little difficult to promise that. So it does raise really important issues. So I'm afraid we're just about out of time, and I did promise to reserve some time at the end for our chairs to make some final comments. So let me invite Lucy Bailey to draw a few conclusions. Then I'll ask the chair of our committee to do so, and we'll wrap up. Lucy, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Bill. So yes, it's been a really interesting discussion and some really interesting presentations. I think I've been picking up more similarities than differences between the different types of disposal facility. The Director General said right at the beginning that it's a hard but not impossible task to deal with these wastes, and I think we would all agree with that. And I think those of us that have been working in this industry over sort of decades would echo that. And we've seen progress from starting to think about, what are the actual things we need to include in our safety case, to now actually some quite detailed methodologies of putting a safety case together, thinking about the safety functions. This was something that our Swedish colleagues brought to the international scene, has been hugely helpful, I think, enabling us to sort of hone in on what really matters, what are the things that really matter in a safety case, and then thinking about the FEPs, the features, events, and processes that could affect those safety functions in different situations. And although those situations will be different for each concept, actually, for each disposal concept, whether it's a geological repository, a near surface one, or a mid-depth one, I think the overall concept and the methodology of thinking about safety and putting together a robust safety case that reflects a good design, a well-chosen site, and looks at the safety arguments and the evidence to support them to assure safety. There's a lot of similarity there and a lot of learning that we can share. So yes, I'm excited about the future, excited about collaborating, about working with programs at different stages. And that's another way of learning because the safety case evolves as a repository project evolves. As you identify more information, your uncertainties and the challenges will change, and the level of detail you need to put into your safety case. Because as I said, a safety case is all about informing a decision. So you need to think very much about the context of your safety case, the context of your disposal concept, the inventory, the waste that you're considering, the barriers that you've designed to contain them, your national and regulatory context, and also your stakeholder context. So all those contexts are important in terms of developing your safety case. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. Very well said. Mr. Umeki, please, closing comments.
Yeah, thank you very much. As Lucy said, this webinar is very, very informative and interesting, and it provides the good foundation to step further. In the past few tens of years, RWMC has played a significant role in building the scientific consensus that deep geological repositories are a safe and effective approach to permanently dispose of spent nuclear fuel and high-level waste. As I mentioned, extending its perspective based on the increased requirements by the member countries, RWMC is taking a holistic, sustainable approach to manage radioactive waste to cover from the generation to disposal of radioactive waste. As addressed in this webinar, the IGSC has developed a modern safety case concept and promoted the use of safety functions in demonstrating safety. It has conducted many projects and activities over the years and accumulated valuable experiences for developing robust safety case. This knowledge of IGSC might be useful and transferable to developing safety case for near surface or above ground radioactive waste disposal also. The objective of the workshop in Romania next year, therefore, we will to better understand how to build robust safety case. That means the enhanced confidence for various disposal options. At the workshop, we will discuss more in detail what are the similarities and differences in developing a safety case for various disposal facilities, and what kind of information can be shared among facilities, or what kind of outcome can shared between deep geological repository and other types of geological disposal facilities. From the viewpoints of key safety case elements, including long-term safety, operational safety, and the safety case update in the different stages of repository development, information and knowledge management, R&D needs and the challenges. This will be strongly linked with the ongoing RWMC activities. RWMC already launched the Working Party of Information Data Knowledge Management for the back end of nuclear fuel cycle, and also expert group on building constructive dialogue between regulators and implementers in developing disposal solution for radioactive waste. These are quite related to the issues for the more robust safety case discussed today. And extended activity of the safety case for various radioactive waste disposal facilities are strongly linked with the RWM's activities that follow the holistic approach. We are also organizing the workshop on pre-disposal management of radioactive waste to evaluate the latest strategy and practices in terms of optimization. And so the optimization should be considered at the different levels, not only within the safety case, but also the linked with the pre-disposal management and the disposal. So we should further to discuss what is the optimization and what constraints should be considered for the different level of optimizations. Anyway, the outcome of the webinar is very informative and valuable again to provide a useful foundation to step forward. I thank the speakers and the panelists very much for the excellent presentations and active discussion, and also thank the audience for the participation. Thank you very much, Director General Magud.
Thank you very much, Mr. Umeki. Ms. Bailey, thanks to both of you for not just participating in today's webinar, but for the important work you do chairing the groups that you oversee within the NEA context, which brings so many experts together to reach common understanding on these important issues. So thanks to you, and also thanks to Chris McKinney and Virginie Roslin and Alice Dima for participating today. All of their comments are extremely important to us. And I welcome all of you to register for the upcoming workshop that we have been talking about, the workshop on developing safety cases for various radioactive waste disposal facilities. Will be held again in Bucharest, Romania. If you haven't been to Romania, here's your chance. If you don't know what you've been missing, that will be February 8 through 10 in 2022. So look forward to seeing all of you there in person, not virtually, but in person. And that way you can enjoy all the great Romanian food. So with that, thank you again for joining us, and thank you for participating in this important discussion. And with that, I will hand it back to our disembodied voice to close us out.
Thank you to all, and thank you to all of those who participated, as well as our speakers. For more updates and news, we also encourage you to follow us on social media. The NEA is on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Thank you, and goodbye for now.